At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Hi there, it's Justin. Just before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to check something really important. Are you subscribed to my Think Faith newsletter? If not, you're missing out on articles, news, events, and updates. Subscribe today and I'll send you the first chapter of my surprising Rebirth book. And one more thing, with the return of season 2 of the podcast, I would really value your monthly support to help me make this podcast looking at how the tide of faith is coming back in on the West. Become a silver supporter and you'll get early access to episodes plus exclusive bonus video content. Gold supporters also get signed copies of both my books and an invitation to The Inner Circle, a monthly catch-up with me on Zoom. For the newsletter or to support, go to the links with today's episode.
Those who wish to stop our cause have tried to take my freedom and indeed to take my life. Just a few months ago in a beautiful Pennsylvania field, an assassin's bullet ripped through my ear.
When Donald Trump was inaugurated as the 47th President of the United States of America, there were plenty of people, POTUS included, invoking God.
But I felt then, and believe even more so now, that my life was saved for a reason. I was saved by God to make America great again.
Mr. President, the last 4 years, there are times I'm sure you thought it was pretty dark. But look what God has done. We praise Him and give Him glory.
But not every preacher the president sat under during his first 24 hours in office so readily endorsed his divine right to rule.
Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you. And as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now.
Bishop Marianne Edgar Buddy's sermon delivered at Washington National Cathedral and urging Trump to have mercy on immigrants and LGBT youth divided opinion. To some, they were prophetic words, speaking truth to power. To others, politicized propaganda that has no place in the pulpit. But it was far from the only time that different interpretations of Christianity would make the news during the first few days of Trump's term.
But there's this old school, and I think it's a very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country, and then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world.
This clip of J.D. Vance defending Aquinas' view of how we should order our loves for family, neighbors, and foreigners in defense of Trump's America First policy created quite the theological stir, especially when Rory Stewart, co-host of The Rest is Politics, one of the UK's top-rated podcasts, got into a Twitter spat with the Vice President.
The idea that you put yourself first and your family first and your country first, you don't really need Jesus for. That's basically what Genghis Khan believed. It's what most of us believe, and it's perfectly instinctive, natural, selfish human reaction. Put myself and my family first. What actually made Christ radical was that he pushed us to think well beyond that. And so much of his message is in fact directly against what J.D. Vance seems to be implying.
Whatever your view of the Bishop Buddy episode or Rory versus Vance, it's clear that religion is far from redundant in the new political era of Trump. Indeed, the question who has the true take on Christ's teachings seems to be more at stake than ever. It's likely that Trump, who has struggled to name a favourite scripture verse in the past, wasn't too concerned about theological nuances. Vance, on the other hand, has a different history with faith, and as we begin our second season of the surprising rebirth of belief in God, it is the vice president's story, rather than Trump's, that has the most relevance to my thesis that atheism is dead as a cultural force, and the West is waking up to the power of faith once again.
So, who is J.D. Vance? The 39-year-old from Ohio rose to prominence in 2016 with the release of his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy. A Netflix adaptation of the best-selling book would follow in 2020. It tells the story of Senator Vance's impoverished childhood in the Appalachian Mountains of southern Ohio, where he was predominantly raised by his grandparents as his mother struggled with opioid addiction.
J.D. Vance's nomination as the running mate of Donald Trump during the 2024 US election race was a surprise to many. In previous years, he had been critical of Trump's morality and brand of politics, but like many Republicans, eventually decided Trump was the best option on offer for America, especially following the assassination attempt on the former president's life.
It's just such an honor to be on the ticket with him. It's such an honor to stand with him after what happened last Saturday. I'm sure that you've heard a lot of people say this, but you will never be able to convince me that that last second turn of a head was anything other than a miracle. I absolutely believe that.
Like his running mate, Vance was not typical of those who enter politics, but his humble beginnings in a poor and dysfunctional Appalachian family became the subject of a best-selling novel and feature film.
You write about adverse childhood consequences that some kids suffer in growing up. Being sworn at, insulted, or humiliated by your parents.
Check.
Being pushed, grabbed, or having something thrown at you.
Check.
Having parents who are separated or divorced.
Check.
Living with an alcoholic or a drug user.
Check.
Living with someone who is depressed or attempted suicide.
Check.
Watching a loved one be physically abused.
Check.
You're batting 1,000.
Yeah.
Perhaps it was his unvarnished and straight-talking background that helped Vance, alongside Trump, reach so many voters feeling disenfranchised by a political elite.
People who I know who are very well educated, who typically have pretty sophisticated attitudes about politics, will talk about Trump supporters as if they are just, Donald Trump is the dumb redneck candidate that these dumb racist rednecks deserved all along and who they've wanted.
This is Vance speaking during Trump's first run for office.
There is a complete failure, and you see it in the way that a lot of people in the elite media talk about Trump supporters. There's a complete failure to recognize that folks are fundamentally complicated and that they can be driven to vote for someone beyond just racism, right? It's so one-dimensional the way that they think of people that it proves in a lot of ways the very worst suppositions that my people have about the elites, which is that they don't really care about us. They don't try to think and understand us. They just judge us. And as much as I disagree with so many folks back home about Trump in particular, I think that the reaction of a lot of elites to Trumpism or the Trump voter feeds into the very worst narratives of how elites feel about the rest of the country.
The Fox News decision desk can now officially project that Donald Trump will become the 47th President of the United States.
I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th President and your 45th President.
J.D. Vance is now the Vice President of the United States of America, swept to power along with Trump on a political tide of voters that the Democratic Party failed to reach. But Vance's story reflects another changing tide, the surprising rebirth of belief in God. In his youth, Vance rejected the evangelical Christianity he had grown up around, but as he explains in this speech at a faith event, that wasn't the end of the story.
And so by the time that I was in law school, I started to call myself an atheist, and there was a certain arrogance to it. I think that there was this idea that I was smart and wise, and I knew things that my grandma never knew. And I think that arrogance motivates a lot, frankly, of secular culture in our country today. But to me, what really brought me back to Christ was finding a wife and falling in love and thinking about what was required of me as a husband and as a father. And the more that I thought about those deeper questions, the more that I thought that there was wisdom in the Christian faith that I had completely discarded and completely ignored, but was most relevant to the questions that were presented in my life as a husband and a father.
In fact, J.D. Vance's adult return to faith saw him enter the Roman Catholic Church in 2019. He's written extensively about how his journey involved an intellectual component, as he was persuaded by the thinking of Catholic theologians, but how Christianity also answered a personal meaning crisis as he sought to become a better husband, father, and citizen. Yet Vance's professed faith remains a contradiction for many. Alongside a dizzying number of executive orders from Trump and his right-hand man Elon Musk that have sent a sledgehammer through US domestic affairs, major international controversy has also marked Vance's first months in office, from his denunciation of European leaders at the Munich Security Council to astonishing scenes in Trump's Oval Office with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring it into this conflict.
You have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. Remember this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you?
This moment, like so many, was met with wildly polarized reactions. Supporters hailed the newly combative politics of Trump and Vance as a demonstration of strong leadership, putting American interests first. Others saw Trump and Vance, once himself a victim of abusive upbringing, now playing the part of schoolyard bullies themselves towards a man trying to stop an illegal invasion of his home country. So why am I beginning this first episode of our new season of the surprising rebirth of belief in God with J.D. Vance's story of political victory, personal rebirth, and public controversy? Because it encapsulates the coming together of two significant movements: the swing towards conservative, nationalist right-wing politics in many parts of the world, especially among men, and the growth of interest in traditional religious values and Christianity among many of the same people. It turns out this rebirth is complex. J.D. Vance is a prescient example of the paradox of politics, faith, and power coming together in ways that will delight some and dismay others. But however messy it is, and whatever you think of some of its protagonists, I firmly believe a surprising rebirth of belief in God is underway. We shouldn't embrace it uncritically, but we can't ignore it either. Instead, I hope that through telling stories, profiling helpful voices, and bringing a variety of different points of view together in conversation, we will better understand both the challenges and enormous opportunities that this cultural moment is bringing with it. In Season 1 of this podcast, I charted the rise and fall of new atheism and the growth of a new conversation on faith among secular intellectuals, along with many surprising stories of rebirth. We'll continue to tell those stories in this new season, but we'll also be diving into some of the key questions and objections raised by this evolving movement. And today we begin by asking, is the rebirth right-wing? My name's Justin Brierley, and in this podcast series, I'm bringing you the inside account of why a meaning crisis in the modern world and the search for a better story about life is leading many 21st century people to reconsider Christian faith. In this season, I'll be bringing you a mix of long-form interviews, live events, and our much-loved documentary episodes as I continue to explore whether we're seeing signs that the tide of faith is coming back in on the West. Welcome back to Season 2 of the surprising rebirth of belief in God. Episode 1, Is the Rebirth Right-Wing?
I'm excited to share with you something that's been a source of both information and inspiration for me personally, the Worldview Bulletin newsletter. The Worldview Bulletin is your go-to source for exploring the Christian worldview and apologetics. Dive into thought-provoking articles that reveal the goodness, truth, and beauty of the Christian faith. Whether you're new to faith or a seasoned believer, the Worldview Bulletin offers free and paid options tailored to deepen your understanding. Start today at worldviewbulletin.substack.com or simply search Worldview Bulletin online. Be equipped, informed, and inspired. Subscribe now.
First, I want to update you on the situation in Southport, where violence has broken out tonight following that horrific knife attack yesterday morning. Merseyside police say that a large group of people who it says are believed to be supporters of the far-right English Defence League have been throwing items in the direction of a mosque in Southport.
If they catch us, they're gonna kill us.
Watching on in horror as outside their window, an angry crowd tried to turn over a police van. This is the moment Hamid and Abdullah, not their real names, thought they were going to die.
I utterly condemn the far-right thuggery we've seen this weekend. Be in no doubt, those that have participated in this violence will face the full force of the law. I guarantee you will regret taking part in this disorder, whether directly or those whipping up this action online.
When a 17-year-old young man, Axel Ruder-Cabana, went on a stabbing rampage at a dance lesson in Southport, England in July 2024, it left 3 children dead and several seriously injured. However, the horrific incident led to several days of riots and unrest in the city and other parts of the UK as anti-immigration riots broke out as rumours about the killer's identity spread online. Labour leader Keir Starmer, recently elected as British Prime Minister, clamped down swiftly on rioters attacking police, mosques and hotels where migrants and asylum seekers were being housed. But some claimed a 2-tier policing was at play that overlooked the Muslim youths who also engaged in running battles with rioters. And Conservative pundits argued that cracking down on the rioters didn't solve the legitimate fears that underlay the protests in many deprived areas of the country.
He and the Home Secretary are just going to keep on repeating the same mantra. This is all about far-right thuggery. This is not, there is far-right, an element of far-right, of course there is, but a lot of people involved in this are people who genuinely feel aggrieved and overwhelmed by uncontrolled migration to this country.
If the society isn't working for you financially, and joblessness has actually gone up, and on top of that, you have challenges to your identity. Well, of course, there's a cause right there, and not an ignoble one. If it's about saying, you know, I want to defend my culture and all of that, ignoble once somebody thinks that the best way of doing that is to pick up a brick and throw it at a policeman or at a place of worship.
Krish Kandiah is a Christian who works with refugees and asylum seekers. Speaking on the Re-Enchanting podcast, he explained why he believes some right-wing influencers are using anti-immigration rhetoric to play on people's fear.
This kind of shift towards the extreme end of the right wing isn't just happening here, it's happening in lots of places around the world, around Europe. You've got all sorts of economic pressures, and so give people a scapegoat and people are willing to take it. And sometimes, again, it's playing on good intentions, but weaponizing them. So who doesn't want to keep their family safe?
Exactly.
Who doesn't want to make sure children are going to be okay?
Yeah.
Who doesn't want to make sure that people get jobs and there's law and order, right? So those are good instincts, but they can play on them and weaponize them, and then suddenly you're doing something you didn't expect to be doing. I was worried that a lot of the young people that were being radicalized by this, anti-immigrant sentiment, actually could be quite impressionable, vulnerable, and suddenly they've been, co-opted into someone else's scheme. And so that's why I think the punishment that's being meted out, it is appropriate that we punish people that broke the law and endanger people's lives, but it's often the kind of foot soldiers that have been charged rather than the influences that instigated that. And I think they have more responsibility, and we need to go after that.
Christian journalist Heather Tomlinson has written on the riots and says that while the violence is inexcusable, the lack of a proper conversation on immigration has not helped.
I think honest conversations need to be had. So people who, for whatever reason, are against mass immigration, then their opinions and the reasons for those, they need to be able to express them, and they need to be given a voice in the public square. Hopefully those voices will be reasonable and not driven by hate and so on. But the reality is that isn't happening, and some of them are quite hateful. But I think that one of the problems and one of the reasons that's being fueled is because those conversations haven't been allowed, and people feel like they're having a situation imposed on them that they don't want. Ignoring the problem, with all of these problems, extremism in each different political grouping, whether it's far right, far left, Islamic, it has to be, we have to do something rather than just let it snowball, because, history shows where that leads. And I think we have to, certainly the church needs to be at the forefront of being willing to have difficult conversations about it.
Whatever the motivations behind last summer's riots, the tensions that came to the surface in towns and cities across the UK are being mirrored in the political reinvigoration of many right-wing parties and populist platforms across the West. From Trump's promises of mass deportation of illegal immigrants in the USA, to the electoral success of Nigel Farage's anti-immigration reform party in the UK, to the significant gains of nationalist parties in France, Germany, Italy, and many other parts of Europe.
For years, a number of solidly right-wing and far-right parties have permeated European politics and run on platforms of opposing the European Union and immigration. Most of these parties also have a strong anti-establishment slant, since they perceive the current institutions are being corrupted by left-wing ideology. In opposition to this, their platforms are solidly conservative. For example, many deny climate change as they see it as an attempt by cosmopolitan elites to socially engineer the population and lower standards of living. They apply the same logic to LGBTQ+ issues, which they perceive as an erosion of traditional family values. As such, they attempt to appeal to working and lower middle class voters, who generally feel that their way of life is being threatened by globalization.
However, the turn towards a more conservative-leaning politics is complex. In his election win, Trump made unexpected gains among Black and Hispanic voters, groups that have traditionally been Democratic strongholds. Some say the result of the US election was as much about the Democrats losing touch with working-class voters as it was the appeal of Trump's policies. But wider social changes are afoot, especially among young men who are becoming far more conservative than young women.
That cohort is growing. That's why I don't think all of Gen Z are just left-wing woke warriors.
This is the self-styled Catholic reactionary Zoomer podcast host Connor Tomlinson speaking to Andrew Gold.
I think there is a cohort of reactionaries who see that there is very little to conserve, who again grew up since 1997 when things did not get better, and who have looked for answers and are implementing that practically in their own lives, and politically are looking to the sorts of parties that are hoping to rectify this. And this is why I think, so the King's Speech just passed, and there was the commitment in there to lower the voting age to 16. And I'd wager that backfires. Give it 5 more years of worsening economic, cultural, and demographic conditions, 5 more years of alternative media and various political figures making compelling TikToks, and you're going to see a growing cohort of particularly young men, but also young women, fearing for their safety, voting for the likes of Le Pen and Bardella, or the AfD in Germany, or Farage in the UK, or particularly in November, Donald Trump.
The irony in all this is that the recent successes of the right have arguably been fueled by the overreach of the left on issues such as gender, race and identity. When figures like J.K. Rowling, once mainstays of liberal progressive arts and culture, suddenly find themselves labelled as right-wing bigots for their stance on transgender and women's rights, you can see how much things have changed. The well-known actor and comedian Stephen Fry summarised his view of the situation recently on the Trigonometry podcast.
Most of the time, the left's greatest sin seems to be, and I speak as a sort of leftist, is they would rather be right than effective. Mm-hmm. And that to me is I'm very English in that regard. I come from the empirical tradition, and things should work. Things should have an effect. They should, and if it's simply just the usual screams of racism and so on, then that's not going to help. It's not going to help stop the rise of reform. It's not going to stop the terrible deaths of immigrant families coming in on rickety boats across the channel. It's not going to help anything. And almost everything that I dislike about the rise of the right in America and here and in Europe, I can say is probably the fault of the left.
As Fry indicates, as activism has caused the left to lurch even further in progressive directions, those who might have once considered themselves left-wing or centrists now find themselves on the right of politics on various social issues. That all gives, very briefly, a sketch of some of the reasons why a revival of right-wing politics is taking place within parts of the West. Of course, it's important to note that there is a wide spectrum within right-wing politics itself, and we'll later touch on some of the schisms it has experienced in recent times. However, the rebirth of the right-wing raises a significant question for my overall thesis that there is a surprising rebirth of belief in God. It was an objection put to me in person by YouTube host Alex O'Connor during our dialogue in Edinburgh last year.
But it seems to me that what's really going on here is, notice, for example, that a lot of the people that are pointed to, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, these people occupy the political right. Is that a coincidence? Do you think that Douglas Murray considers himself to be Christian adjacent because he's sort of sat in a room somewhere, prayed to God and started to hear someone talking back? Or do you think he's just upset with the way that the country's going, has been convinced by people like Tom Holland to identify the Western civilization ethic with Christianity, and therefore started sort of cozying up to Christianity as a defense mechanism against Islamism and wokeism and Putin and China? So there's a rebirth of anything. I think it's a rebirth of, the utility of religion.
So, this is the question that Alex and many others have posed to me since I began this podcast series. Is the rebirth right-wing? It's certainly fair to say that many of the examples I've focused on, from those who are talking about the value of Christianity again, think Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan and Douglas Murray, as well as some of those who have converted, such as Ayaan Hirsi Ali, among others, are all broadly anti-woke and conservative-leaning on many issues. Now, does that mean this is just a cynical co-opting of Christianity for a political agenda that mirrors the current conservative backlash against progressive ideologies in various parts of the West? That's the question I'm attempting to unpack in this episode. At one level, it's no surprise that those who are interested in conservative values are interested in conserving various aspects of Western values and institutions, and that they're therefore being drawn to the stable foundations of the West's Christian heritage. Many see the rise of today's progressive activist causes around gender, identity, race and the environment as a quasi-religious imitation of Christianity itself, but subverted in ways that are now acting to destabilize society. We won't repeat the arguments here, but in Season 1, we met many of those who have become convinced that the only hope for a stable future is a return to Christian values and even a re-embrace of the Christian story itself. However, as we'll find out later, there are plenty of centrist and left-leaning figures who are part of this surprising rebirth movement too. After all, the meaning crisis that we also explored in Season 1 is affecting people across all walks of life and political strata. I believe the search for a better story is happening across many demographics. It may just be that we tend to hear about it most audibly from those on the right. But all this raises another important question. How interested should we be in preserving our specific Western civilization? There is, after all, a difference between Christendom and Christianity. Well, I hope wherever you fall on the political spectrum, my attempts to investigate these questions are helpful as I try to steer a non-partisan line in addressing the issues. Listeners on the left, the right or the centre are all welcome here, and of course such labels rarely tend to encompass the full range of anybody's political and social commitments. Indeed, as I mentioned, there's a huge spectrum of positions within what we might call the right wing, and of course many people swap their political allegiances at various points in their lives. For now, I want to introduce you properly to the journalist we met a short while ago. Heather Tomlinson has had both a religious and political conversion of sorts as an adult. She didn't grow up with any faith, and when she began her journalistic career, had been schooled in the politics of the progressive left.
Did you know that leaving a rating and a review on your podcast app helps others to discover this show? Thanks to Bickwiser, who described it as something rare and precious, providing spiritually crafted brain food and a spiritual uplift. Sharing an episode with others on social media also makes a huge difference. But the way you can make the biggest difference to this show is by supporting my work, either via Patreon from anywhere in the world or through US tax-deductible giving from the USA. Either option gets you the same perks. Become a silver supporter and you'll get early access to episodes plus exclusive bonus video content. Gold supporters also get signed copies of both my books and the chance for a monthly catch-up with me on Zoom. And I get so much out of those catch-ups with supporters myself. I really love them. So to support, just go to the links with today's episode info.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
We off? 30 seconds of carefree bliss. Oof, like wind in your hair carefree. Oh, like using Clorox disinfecting all-purpose cleaner in the home carefree. Yes. Like dog slobbing on the coffee table and cleaning it with Clorox Carefree? He's on a roll now. Spit toothpaste on the faucet. You got it. You got it. Peanut butter on the light switch. Oh, spritz, spritz. Spritz, spritz. Clorox, man. Clean feels good. Okay, we're back. Use as directed.
So I was a very left-wing, very sort of bolshy, young person. I was very lucky to get into national newspaper journalism at a young age on two papers that I really liked, the political stances of The Independent on Sunday and The Guardian. But I left because I kind of found inside there was something that really wanted something more. And I didn't really at the time know what that was. But I left to work in the NHS in mental health and to retrain. And in that process, I started a spiritual quest. So I went to Buddhist retreats, I read the Quran, I did all the sort of things that you might expect to do in a spiritual quest. And I was completely surprised that what really seemed to be most meaningful and really drew me was the teachings of Jesus when I read them. So I wrestled with that. The things that appealed to me, being honest, it was quite societal, political. And so the aspects of Jesus' teachings that are political or can be used to justify social justice, care for the poor, and things like that. I really liked that, and especially how radical they were. I really liked that a lot. So I started to go to churches, to be a complete pain in the nether regions for Christians, asking lots of difficult questions and just generally being awkward. Very long story short, I decided to get baptised really because I just wanted to commit my life. I thought, I like this Jesus, I want to commit my life to him. But in hindsight, I hadn't really really found faith. But a few months after that, I had a very powerful experience of God's love, and that changed things. I stopped arguing with everybody. Right, stop being so difficult. And I started to do lots and lots of social justice work, actual practical mission work. And in that process, and in the process, I think, of growing in faith, then I started to question my old ethics and values and became much more politically conservative, but probably also, well, I think definitely also more open-minded, sort of a reality that actually previously I'd completely got everything wrong. So maybe I should just be a little bit more humble and try and be more open-minded about various issues. So now, and before I was a left-wing, I wasn't an atheist. I wasn't even really an agnostic. I had a vague belief in God. But I went from a left-wing sort of believing-ish, but definitely not Christian, to a conservative-leaning, some people call it traditionalist Christian, Orthodox Christian. One of the reasons that my politics changed with my spirituality is as I grew in Christ and became more open to God, there was much more of a sense of personal responsibility. So in my old worldview, I would say it's quite common for me to blame other things. If there was a problem in my life, it was somebody else's fault. It was the government, or it was this person, or it was that group, or whatever. And for people on the left, it's quite often the rich, or the Tories, or whatever. But with my faith, grew more. I think with the love of God, you become more willing to look at your own part in problems and actually what is my own behaviour bringing to my problems, and what can I do about that to change it.
I asked Heather for her take on the conservative thinkers and influencers who have gravitated towards Christianity for its cultural value.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because I don't think using Christianity as a political tool is a good thing, but at the same time, I believe that there's some truth in what they're saying, in that genuinely practiced, Christianity does offer any society lots of good things. So I would agree with that in a sense, and I think that's just people observing. Well, actually, in a society where people have Christian values like self-sacrifice, forgiveness, the reality of biological sex, shall we say, family values, these are good things, and we've lost them. And Christianity had brought those, so let's rethink it. I think that's a good thing. But really what Christianity is about is not, societal values, although that might be important. It's about what do we do about this, in Christian terms, the sin in our own hearts. So you can take any society, whether it's run along left-wing, right-wing, various religions' points of view. If that society is full of people who are unhappy, angry, selfish, can't control their own impulses and desires, and things like that, then that society is not going to be a good society. What makes a society good is that people, individuals and communities, families and communities, and as it spreads, become more loving, more gracious, more patient, more self-sacrificial. These are things that help. And the great news of Christianity is that we have a solution for that. We have a saviour who can change our hearts and make us more loving. And it's usually a slow process. It certainly has been for me. But that, for me, is the answer. If we want a good society, then we need people to be transformed from within, from any kind of residual resentment, hatred, all of these negative things that make our world so horrible. We need to be on the path together to healing from all of that. Negativity would be a secular word, but sin would be the Christian word. And I think that that's what Jesus offers. To a certain extent, government policies that are sympathetic to certain kinds of things probably a good thing. But it's in the individual heart. The way that Christianity spread was that spreading this message and people coming to realise there isn't Christ for themselves. And as that spreads, then hearts are changed, societies are changed. And that, for me, is the hope that Christianity offers.
Heather has often reported on what she sees as the dangers of left-wing ideology and activism. Some 10 years ago, she was the person who first introduced me to the term identity politics before it entered common parlance. But she says that recently her own side has given her just as much cause for concern.
For quite a few years, I've been worried about extremism within the left. I'm currently just as worried about extremism on the right. I keep writing about it and tweeting about it in the hope that I'm sort of like challenging Christians to kind of like be aware, just at least be aware of it, and be careful who they're supporting. It's difficult because I do believe, I don't think pointing fingers and saying you're a Nazi is an answer to these things. I think behind the scenes dialogue, listening and debating, but clear, challenging to racist or anti-Semitic beliefs is important. Just rejecting it and saying they're all evil isn't going to help. But I'm very concerned about it, and I really think Christians need to be very careful about who they're listening to and who they're supporting, and to distinguish it with genuine. So, for example, that Ayaan Hirsi Ali is very critical about immigration, mass immigration, as is people like Douglas Murray. I think if you listen to their arguments, they're legitimate arguments. They need to be heard and part of the conversation. So I'd then lumping in those people who have reasonable points to make with people who are, denying the Holocaust and things like that. Is not a good idea, but that is what's happening. I've seen her described as far right. I don't think that's so helpful. I think that label's best kept to people who are far right, in my opinion. But I think Christians on whatever area or beliefs, politics, values you hold, we just need to be really aware of our own selves and the hatred within. And to be working to get rid of it, because I really think we're going to get swept up in a horrible conflict otherwise.
As Heather notes, the extremes are growing at both ends of the left and the right, something I've also noticed with increasing concern, especially in right-wing online spaces like X and YouTube. This includes the rise of openly racist or anti-Semitic voices being profiled by large platforms, such as Tucker Carlson's interview with a historian who questions the Holocaust. Commentator Candace Owens left the Daily Wire following controversy around her views on Jewish people and an increasing advocacy for conspiracy theories. Some classic liberals have even given the label of the woke right to those in conservative circles who themselves insist on seeing everything through power dynamics and victimhood. As Alex Kashuta says in this trigonometry interview, the right itself is splintering due to the growth of its popular online personalities.
What are these movements? They have a few key influencers, some of them, and they kind of set policy for the movements. And to grow your specific circle, you kind of have to cleave off audience from the other circles. And then you enter into these beefs for whatever point of doctrine. There's beef around, should we be a wife guy, or is, women loving women and having a peaceful home with them gay, or something like
What a conversation.
This is an important conversation. On the right, obviously there's a split between religious and atheist right-wingers, or people who are like maybe more into like pagan vibes and things like that. That's a big fault line. So, that's kind of, and obviously the influencers in these spaces, especially because now there's more attention to these spaces, because there really is a lot of generative, interesting stuff happening there. That's why I'm in this space. They're getting a lot of attention. There's a bit of money. Actually, people are getting whatever signups and whatever Substack money. And yeah, there's more incentive to present yourself as, the actual heir of the right wing in general, and this is the program, and my 10-point program is much more coherent than your 10-point program. And yeah, people fighting over immigration, like there's the major fault line now is between people who are kind of Christian, and they essentially are looking forward to, a right wing with kind of a Christian core as kind of the morality of whatever proposed state that they'd like to live in. And people who say, oh, no, Christianity essentially just means, open borders because you just let in anyone in the world who's Christian. And that obviously has a lot of, bad side effects in the sense that we're pretty much at square one and we have the same social ills that we have now, but everyone's nominally Christian. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the main divide here. And I there is something to these arguments. Obviously, they need to be discussed, but the fact that they end up, in the sense that, okay, we need to purge you, we need to cleave you off, and whoever is with me has to stay on this side of the fence, and whoever is not with me needs to leave. It's it's definitely it's a interesting and lively time to be in right-wing politics on the internet.
Here's Glenn Scrivener of Speak Life trying to make sense of what the confusing din of online politics means for Christians.
So what do you think? Do you think option A, we're going to blast off into progressive liberationism? Do you think we'll snap back to a worship of the strong and that Nietzsche will win the day? Do you think that Christian revival will happen? And just as Justin Brierley says, there's a surprising rebirth of belief in God, and the trickle will become a flood, and the church will be revived in our day. Which is it? A, B, or C? Do you want to know what I think? I think option D, all of the above. All of the above is going to happen. All of the above is happening. Okay? And it's a mess. And it's going to be a mess. Will there be Christian revival in our day? I can totally see that happening. I can totally see that happening, and I pray for that happening. And maybe we are seeing the first trickle of a future flood. That might be happening. Option C, in our lifetime, Christian revival. Amen. Bring it on. I don't think Christian revival is just what Christians think might happen. I think more and more people are starting to think that we might have a return to the source. So yes, will C happen? Yes, C will happen. Will option A happen? Progressive liberationism, and we blast off into the stratosphere, completely divorced from nature, completely divorced from the Christian story. Yes, that is happening. And do I think option B, will there be a snap back to the default nature of the flesh in which power rules everything? Yes, I think that is happening. And I think Christians need to not be naive about option B. Maybe you are co-belligerent with option B when it comes to trans issues, and you think that certain people who are basically in option B are saying sane things about trans ideology, whereas people in option A are saying insane things about trans ideology. You might be right about that, but don't throw your lot in with option B, because option B also will erode everything about human rights, right? If it's just about nature, then they don't actually fundamentally have a grounding for believing in the inviolable worth and dignity of all people, of human rights, of equality, of compassion, of freedom, of progress. But they have no substantial reason for maintaining that. And that, therefore, is a very dystopian future, just as option A is a very dystopian future. But it will all happen together. It will be a mess.
A mess is about right. Indeed, the Christian right has likewise seen a messy splintering taking place. One online controversy last summer concerned the release of journalist Megan Basham's book, Shepherds for Sale, in which she accused many high-profile evangelicals of being in the pay of left-wing political and business interests. Many of the accused have criticised Basham's book as politicised and riddled with errors, but its warm reception among many others is symptomatic of the way even conservative Christians are now splitting into varied factions, including those vying for a more militant form of Christian nationalism. Here's Glenn Scrivener again with some really helpful advice on why Christians shouldn't be captured by any political side.
You know, what's that saying? It's a curse, may you live in interesting times. Well, it seems like we're living in interesting times, and there's curse to it, but there's also real blessing to it. So look, if you're a Christian listening to this, make sure that your views on all these issues, whether it's immigration or trans issues or whatever it is, that they're fundamentally Christian, that they're not just progressive left-wing post-Christian beliefs, or conservative right-wing post-Christian beliefs, because that's what my social media feed is full of. I'm sure your social media is full of essentially post-Christian progressive views and post-Christian conservative views. What is distinctively and robustly Christian about our position on immigration, for instance? Not just slogans, but actually robustly, biblically, let's read from Genesis to Revelation and get a real sense on how we be hospitable, right? What does that mean domestically? What does that mean for the church? What does that mean for the state? Let's think theologically about these things, not just reactively. Whether your reaction is just the vibe of compassion or your reaction is the vibe of breaking point, right? A and B are just bringing vibes to you. Let's make sure we're grounded in the scriptures on these things. Same thing on trans. You might have a vibe of thinking, okay, the trans stuff is clearly nonsense. But what is a biblical view of gender? And is gender the same as biological sex in the Bible? I don't know. Do a study from Genesis to Revelation. See what you think. You won't end up in the same place as Stonewall or David Tennant, but you also might not end up in the same place as certain gender-critical theorists end up either. You might actually have a Christian view of these things. We need to be very distinctively option C. We need to very distinctively say, I refuse the dilemma, and be a place of refuge for the burnt-out A's and the burnt-out B's, because C is genuinely the source of these things. C, the Christian church, the scriptures, Jesus Christ, is truly where life is to be found, life in all its abundance. So Christians drill down into the Christian thing, because I think the Christian thing is the future, even as these other two futures fight it out in the public sphere.
TaxAct knows small business owners can sometimes use a little help with their taxes. That's why TaxAct has Expert Assist, a team of live tax experts ready to answer any questions you may have. Think of them as your own personal sidekick. Not like one of those funny talking animal sidekicks, more like the super smart nerding out on tax code and business casual attire sidekick, but just as helpful and lovable. TaxAct. Let's get them over with.
Over the past several days, 3 females have been found dead.
Looks like someone's going after these girls. Then they have to know to watch their backs.
Streaming March 13th.
You really want what happened to this woman that happened to you?
Exactly why I need to keep going on this.
Starring Emmy Award winner Amanda Seyfried.
I'm worried about what you're gonna find. So am I.
Long Bright River, a limited series. Streaming March 13th, only on Peacock.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Of course, Christians live in the real world of hard political and social questions and may find themselves at various points in agreement or disagreement with both left and right, as Bible scholar Chris Watkin explains.
So on some issues, Christians are going to find themselves, co-belligerent with your Enlightenment rationalists. Even your Richard Dawkins types. In other social questions, Christians are going to find themselves co-belligerent with your sort of post-Nietzschean critical theory types. But with none of these groups do Christians always exhaustively find themselves in agreement. So it's a series of shifting, alliances, shifting agreements. And it's not as easy as saying, Christians are always being persecuted or whatever by this monolithic thing called society. It's a lot more complex than that.
So how should Christians navigate the polarized world of society and politics? Chris Watkin's award-winning book, Biblical Critical Theory, aims to show how Scripture itself sets the terms of the debate. I sat down with Chris to ask why he claims that all the great political theories of the modern world derive from the story of the Bible.
A good case can be made, I think, that Marx and other modern critical theories are actually derivative of biblical critical theory. That they're taking particular moves that the Bible makes and particular sensitivities that the Bible has, they're actually ripping them out of context, and they're providing emaciated and, without meaning to be disrespectful, the only word that comes to mind is half-baked versions of biblical truths. So if you think about what Marx needs for his theory to work, for example, you need a linear idea of history and you need an idea of historical progress. Now, he gets that through Hegel. Where does Hegel get it from? Well, the idea of a linear history comes into the tradition through Paul, through Augustine, City of God. And so that's a fundamental building block already that Marx is piggybacking on the Judeo-Christian tradition in order to have. You need an idea of the dignity of the downtrodden, the worthiness of those on the bottom of society. Now, where does that come from? Is profoundly biblical. And that's where it comes from. That's where it originates from. And the idea that liberation from slavery is not only something to be wished for, but is actually identity defining. And I think you'd be hard pressed to say that it comes from anywhere apart from the Exodus narrative as it's taken up in the language of salvation in the New Testament of the Bible. So there's a prima facie case, at least, to say that all of these modern critical theories are derivative of Christianity. And I think that's one reason to give Christianity a look. It won't get people all the way to saying, right, I want to throw in all my eggs in the basket of Christianity. But if, to the extent that that is true, and if that is true, that's quite curious, isn't it? And if we don't know about Christianity in our culture, and it is indeed the origin and basis of all these modern theories, then we perhaps ought to know about it because it's really important, even if we end up not believing in it.
I mean, what you've just done there, you do quite a bit through the book, something that I think has been called diagonalization, to use a sort of technical word. But it's this idea that you're looking at the way in which many philosophers and thinkers over the centuries have sort of taken aspects of the biblical kind of story and worldview. And you're often saying, well, it's neither that or the other. It's these are just sort of, as you call it, sort of reductive heresies of it. So can you explain that a bit more? It's a little bit of a sort of mind-bending concept, but what are you trying to do in this biblical critical theory that sort of is different or transcends the way other people have kind of used bits and pieces of the Christian sort of worldview?
I guess I'm trying to point out that the different political and social theories that we have in the West are usually derivative of Christianity, but derivative in an emaciated, sort of lopsided way. So to take another example, think about that lovely verse from Genesis chapter 1, that human beings, all human beings, are made in the image of God. Now, a huge verse has been written on that, and there are many theories about what precisely that means. But I think fundamentally you can say two things about it, just by looking at that language image of God. One of the things is that there's some sort of dignity that's accorded there to human beings. You know, there's a lot of things in the universe, and a lot of them are really, really impressive, but only human beings are given this title, the image of God. You know, the Milky Way isn't in the image of God. The Mona Lisa isn't as an artifact in the image of God. A beautiful school of Wales, a gorgeous sunset is not in the image of God. So there's something really, really special about human beings. But also there's a sense in this image of God language that, wait a minute, you're not God. You're the image. There is one in whose image you are. And your identity, therefore, your sense of who you are, is contingent on one who's outside you. In order to understand yourself, you've got to understand God. In other words, the book doesn't stop with you. You are not the top dog in the universe. God is. And there's no sense in the image of God language that these two things are fighting against each other, that like you're half dignified and half humbled. There's a beautiful harmony of the two. There's a dignity in the image of God. There's a humbling in the image of God. They go well together. And then you look at the different ways in which we think about human beings in society today. And one way of making sense of all the different ways we do that is to see two tendencies. And one tendency is to go all out on the dignity side of things. And in fact, to paint us as God figures, really. And so today we tend to think that it is our job to do the things that the Bible says God does. So we self-define. We are the ones who say, I am who I am, as God says to Moses. We are the ones who decide for ourselves what is good and evil, which is, of course, in Genesis 1 and 2, what God does. And so we deify ourselves on the one hand, and then you look at other accounts of human beings, and many people today will say, well, we might like to kid ourselves, but if we're honest, we are really only complicated machines or particularly sophisticated animals. Like we dress it up in all fine-sounding language, but really, if we're face facts, that's all we are. And that puts all the eggs in the basket of the humility side and retains none of the dignity. And the wonderful thing about Genesis is that, yes, we're created on day 6, which is the day that the other animals were created. There's an animality about us. There's a materiality about us. But we are in the image of God. And so the Bible is holding together in this wonderful symphonic harmony and a socially healthy harmony, I think, things that modern society has often seen fit to rip apart and make us choose between. So are you going to think of yourself as a god, or are you going to think of yourself as a machine? Now, neither of those options are particularly attractive, I would suggest. And so what it needs to diagonalize that choice is say, wait a minute, both of those options are dismembered limbs from a beautiful biblical body, which is the image of God. So I don't want to choose between them, nor do I want to sort of split the difference between them in some weird way and say, well, perhaps then I'm half God and half machine. Like, what's that? What would that even be like? It's to say, let's see the wonderful whole biblical truth that these two opposing ideas have been ripped apart from and go back to God's original idea, which is that we are made in the image of God. So that would be to diagonalize those two modern anthropologies.
I think we need to talk about, the culmination of a lot of this in the person of Jesus, his life, death and resurrection. Just would you briefly kind of sketch out how this plays into the biblical critical theory? What does Jesus uniquely shed on the way in which the world works, essentially, when we look at it through the lens of his life, death and resurrection?
We could have the whole of this conversation on the incarnation and the way in which that just puts the cat among the pigeons in terms of a whole bunch of assumptions in Western thinking about the way the universe works and the way that just brings, again, a healthiness and a wholeness to the way we think about the world. I think the ministry of Jesus is worth dwelling on, and his teaching about love, for example, and the way that we see the kingdom breaking in his actions. I think that the cross has a huge amount to teach us in terms of a biblical, critical, theoretical approach. And in the book, I go into some of the ways in which the cross has a very peculiar, I don't know what you call it, theoretical shape to it, in the sense that we tend to think in society that things move more or less in a straight line. So the rich sort of get richer. I think we see that happening over time. The poor get poorer, and there's not a huge amount of change there. Those at the bottom tend to remain at the bottom, and those at the top tend to remain at the top. And it's sort of the world's way of thinking about things. And then the cross comes along, and it's just full of paradoxes. Like the moment that seems to the whole world like the moment of final defeat reveals itself to be the moment of great victory. That as Paul shows in Philippians 2, Jesus, by humbling himself even to the point of death on a cross, ends up with a name that is above all other names. Like that shouldn't happen. Like the cross should be the end. Like Rome has won. That should be the final chapter by all earthly logic. And yet the Bible dares to come along and say, oh yes, well, that's what it looks like on the surface. But there is something deliciously subversive going on underneath and so forth. It's just weird thinking. It was weird then, and it's weird today. Because that ain't how the world works, people will say. Look at the rich being rich, look at the poor being poor. And yet to the extent that we let that cross-shaped thinking sink into our pores as Christians, I think it gives us a freedom to risk in our lives, to lose the trappings that the world values, because, well, that's not what it's about, is it? We follow a homeless man who was executed. So it's probably okay for me to lose a bit of money or a bit of reputation. That seems to be the deal that I've signed up to. And as we know, that's not the ultimate measure of my identity or my value or my worth, because the first are last and the last is first. And so actually, as a Christian, this is where it gets uncomfortable for you and me as Christians living in rich countries. Woe to me, actually, if that's the way I see myself. If I look around at my nice office here, at my bank account and at my letters after my name or whatever, that's pretty good. I'm someone. The Bible would say, you fool. That's not the way you think. That might be the way the world thinks, but that's not the way you think. You follow the homeless guy who was killed. And there's a liberation to doing that. And there's a healthiness to society, I think, in thinking that way as well.
Chris explained why, for those disillusioned by politics, the Christian story offers both a painfully realistic yet hopeful account of the broken human condition.
Because the cynic will say, the education system is corrupt, or politics is corrupt, or politicians are on the make. And the Christian comes along and says, I'm afraid it's worse than that. You yourself are part of the problem, as am I, who am speaking with you. And this is not a problem that we can throw money at or that we can throw education at. To use that hackneyed but very useful phrase, the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. And there is nothing you can do about it. And you can spend your whole life trying to fix yourself and fix others, and you will fail. I'm sorry, Justin, to sort of dump this on you, but to the extent that you let that sink in, that is dark, that Christian view. But the Christian, at the same time, as she puts her arm around the cynic and says that to them, also says, but that is not the whole reality. And to sort of fill the story in, we've had creation and fall. With redemption, we say there is a God who frames himself as the God of the impossible. With God, all things are possible. And so we believe as Christians that however bad things get, the sovereign God is in control, and he will fulfill all of his promises. And those promises are outrageous. Like, they are way beyond what any political platform is promising. So the most wild sort of political platform today, might be saying jobs for everybody, education for everybody, 4-day work week, that sort of level. And the Bible says, come on, think bigger. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more mourning or crying or pain, because the old order of things has passed away. Things that were done in the darkness will be brought out into the light. So imagine that during the 17th century, there was an act of abuse that was perpetrated against a boy or a girl somewhere that nobody knew about. And both the victim and the perpetrator died with that secret. That thing there will be brought out into the open. And the person who did that will be held to full account by a judge who is not partial, who sees perfectly, who knows them perfectly, and who will judge justly. Justice for the dead. Like, nobody is so stupid as to promise that today. And yet the Christian, in her hopefulness, in a sober way, that is the future that she hopes for. And that is so much more richly, multidimensionally hopeful than any political platform. And so the Christian both finds herself more cynical than the sort of most pessimistic cynic, and more riotously hopeful than the most optimistic political platform at the same time. And I think that's the distinctiveness of the Christian position. It's being able to hold those two together without either of them shaving the hard corners off the other one.
I find Chris Watkin's vision of a biblical framework that transcends the promises of any political cause, on the left or right, very helpful, because the reality is people on both the left and the right are looking for meaning and a better story. I want to conclude today's episode with a conversation I had with writer Carolyn Morris-Collier, whose recent article for the Gospel Coalition titled The Surprising Rebirth at Oxford reflected on her own experience as a Christian postgrad student from the USA studying at Oxford University, a famously prestigious place, but with an increasingly secular and progressive student body.
I think coming to Oxford was a bit of an awakening, because it definitely was much different than my undergrad. To kind of give you like a brief lay of the land at Oxford. So I think there's a big divide between the undergraduate community and the postgraduate community. The undergraduate community, they know how to test for intelligence, and they've got the brightest of the bright. And the postgrads too, sure, but it's kind of, they're testing this gut innate intelligence. So they've attracted all these young people, and we joke that it's kind of this modge podge of boarding school boys with progressive grunge crowds, and sometimes there's overlap, and yeah, a lot of like cargo shorts and crystals. It's like it's just, you can tell starkly if an undergrad walks by. But then the postgraduate community is more this group of people who are saying, I can't believe I'm here. But yeah, overall, I'd say the student body, of course, leans progressive, but there will always be a conservative stronghold at Oxford just because of kind of the way the university is set up.
Carolyn says that alongside the progressive views of the student body, she also sensed that many of her postgraduate friends were tired of simply critiquing the West and deconstructing colonialism, but were interested in finding ways to build something too, especially in the light of a growing meaning crisis and the fact that their hope in progressive politics had been derailed by Trump's election.
There's a lot of climate anxiety. There's kind of this existential angst looking for some sort of belief structures. And yeah, I mean, one of my friends basically said to me, the election was the last shred of belief that I had that like good social change can come from, these institutions. I think there's just this deep sense of anxiety, and where do we turn? And all of our avenues have been exhausted.
Carolyn says this search for meaning led to a surprise discovery, finding much more openness to Christian faith among her fellow students than she had expected.
Yeah, so I started to kind of sense this interesting moment where when I would say I was a Christian, I kind of was ready for this look of why are you saying that? And instead I kept receiving this kind of, oh, really? Over the year I've heard people say, I'm actually kind of jealous. Like, I just kind of wish I had a faith. People kept bringing it up. I didn't have to initiate conversations. And I've heard this from a few, like from other friends in the city. So there is a mood shift. It feels like maybe 5 to 10 years ago, it would have maybe been embarrassing to kind of bring up these topics.
From my own experience as a student in the late 90s, Oxford University has always had a thriving Christian union, with both Anglo-Catholic and evangelical churches attracting Christian students. But I'd heard from various leaders that something unusual, even for Oxford, has been happening in the last couple of years. Student churches seeing more and more unchurched young people coming through their doors. Carolyn says she's seen this in action as she's increasingly felt comfortable to invite seeking friends to churches that can provide a natural, what she calls, trellis for community and friendship to grow upon.
But one of my friends said, I didn't know young people still came to church. And then suddenly they're seeing, several hundred young people. And the thing that I think that they're struck by is usually that kind of welcoming warmth. But there are still those challenges. I mean, I brought one friend to hear a speaker, and she said, I did not agree with one word that came out of his mouth. But yeah, I just think at the same time, people get how hard it is in modern life to have community, and seeing a group of people that's able to seeing this trellis ready, that's the thing that my friends have been quite fascinated by specifically.
But it's not just evangelical churches scratching the existential itch among students. Carolyn says Oxford's beautiful college chapels, often offering choral evensong or contemplative services of Compline, are also offering a bridge to faith.
It's kind of this undeniable moment of what Lewis calls Sehnsucht, or the transcendent. And we just had a bunch of friends who are just willing to come along, because people are extra willing to come along to something that's like seen as a bit more of a historical service. But yeah, we've had a few friends joke after they left. They're like, that's how Christians get you. They take you to something like Compline, where just the beauty is overwhelming.
But Carolyn says there are different motivations behind this renewed interest in the value of church and faith.
The types of people I kind of narrowed down to two categories, and it's in terms of people who I saw being a bit more interested and open, and it's the religious but not spiritual, and the spiritual but not religious crowd. So we're very used to this maxim of like, oh, I'm spiritual and not religious, people with more New Age and alternative spiritualities. But there's this kind of other crowd forming that Louise Perry coined, that I heard her say that term on her podcast. There's the religious but not spiritual. So people who are kind of interested in the social utility of religion.
It's this latter group, the religious but not spiritual, that Carolyn says are often on the Tom Holland train. As we've explored in our last season, alongside her spiritual awakening, conservative thinker Ayaan Hirsi Ali was convinced to abandon secular atheism intellectually because of Holland's book Dominion and its thesis that the West owes its values and culture to Christianity. But echoing Alex O'Connor's words of warning earlier in this episode, Carolyn says there are pitfalls in wanting to bring back cultural Christianity for a political agenda. She pithily summarises the danger in her article for the Gospel Coalition, writing, "There's a difference between Christianity and Christendom. While Tom Holland's book Dominion makes a convincing case that Western values are rooted in Christian foundations, the reverse is not true. Christianity does not depend on Western civilization and is indeed flowering throughout the global South."
What's the direction that's happening next? Is this spiritual interest purely a conservative interest? And I think the answer is no, there's multiple strains. But yeah, I think that term that Louise Perry said, I'm religious but not spiritual, is something that I have come across several different people here at Oxford who kind of have that same view. One of the most salient times was Ayaan Hirsi Ali spoke at Oxford at a lecture series. And afterwards, a group went to the pub. Some people were Christian, some people were not at all, and they're just socially conservative. And it was just interesting to hear people who were saying, they were atheists a few years ago, being very open to Christianity, using kind of Ayaan's logic that she used in the talk. And I'm so thankful for what God's seemingly, hopefully doing in her life. But her logic in the talk was very straightforward. It was, the West is fragile, insecure, and in danger. Wokeism and Islam are the problem. Well, it's find a powerful force to unite people. Islam seems to be really uniting people as a religion. Christianity seemed to really unite us in the past. So it seems to be a great way to organize societies, preserve traditional values. So then you kind of have people talking about Christianity in this very civilization building defensiveness, and they're just tired of this assault on the West. They want a bit of like glory days, we want cultural pride. And even I think about the Tom Holland train, which the term the Tom Holland train, seeing so many public intellectuals come to faith, including Ayaan. But I think the Tom Holland phenomenon is funny to me because it feels like this massive pat on the back to Christians. Like we're all like, thank you, Tom. Yes, you're right. Western civilization, thank you. And it gives us a bit of like a smug, self-satisfied feeling because Western civilization is rooted in Christianity. But like I kind of noted in my article, the reverse isn't true. So there is a difference between Christianity and Christendom. But yeah, I think at Oxford, especially where you have people who have a deep love for Western civilization and the canon, these kind of arguments are really persuasive. And it is hard to decipher between those kind of cultural and spiritual motivations.
Yet, despite these concerns about the political motivations that may accompany the rebirth, Carolyn says that the cultural and religious vibe shift she's seeing among both progressive and conservative-leaning students at Oxford gives her hope.
To me, I had this sense of excitement. It's not necessarily that we're in the throes of revival, but there seems like to be an interesting beginning. I hope that whatever spiritual interests we're sensing in society, isn't too overly co-opted by political or national agendas. But I have a deep sense of excitement. We're in a different phase of the conversation than what are the rational arguments, and a bit more of saying people are believers by nature. People are especially open to spirituality seemingly right now. How do we help it be a compelling option, and how do we speak to the people that are carrying these deep longings, these deep pains, these deep anxieties? And that is the next phase of the conversation, right? Is how do we as the church move forward? What do we do?
As we approach the end of part 1 of our first episode of season 2, I sense with Carolyn that there is a harvest to be had among a new generation of meaning seekers. The winter of hard-bitten secularism in the West seems to be over. The snow is melting and the spring has arrived. Aslan is on the move, to quote a well-known Oxford don, C.S. Lewis. But C.S. Lewis also said something extremely prescient in a letter written to a friend in 1940. Commenting on communism and fascism, the extremes of left versus right politics in his day, he said he also knew that they were successful to the extent that they drew on fundamentally Christian principles, writing, "Fascism and communism, like all other evils, are potent because of the good they contain or imitate. This does not alter for me the conviction that they are very bad indeed. One of the things we must guard against is the penetration of both into Christianity, availing themselves of that very truth you have suggested and I have admitted. Mark my words, you will presently see both a leftist and a rightist pseudo-theology developing. The abomination will stand where it ought not." With Lewis's warnings about the politicization of Christianity ringing in our ears, let's remember that every birth involves a certain amount of mess, and there's a lot more to unpack and unpick around the political questions circulating today's religious rebirth. That's why I'd like to invite you back to part 2 of this episode next time, when we'll continue to explore the question of whether the rebirth is right-wing. You've been listening to The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God with me, Justin Brierley, continuing to tell the story of why many secular 21st century people are considering Christianity again. I hope you enjoyed episode 1 of our new season. Please do rate and review the podcast and share it with others. By the way, this podcast is also a book where you can read Chapter 1 for free when you subscribe to my newsletter. And if you'd like to help me reach many more people with Thinking Faith, please consider becoming a monthly supporter of my work. Silver supporters get early access to new episodes as well as bonus content. Gold supporters also get signed copies of both my books and a monthly catch-up call with me. The links are with the show notes. Coming up next time in part 2.
The eternal message that's at the foundation of Western civilization is that we are each a divine locus of value.
Christians have been gathering alongside conservative politicians and culture makers again at the ARC conference last month, but we'll also hear why I believe the rebirth phenomenon goes much wider than Jordan Peterson and his friends. Plus, a former far-right activist shares his story of coming to faith.
So I was on the floor, being kicked in the head and in the gut, and looking up at a whole crowd of exactly the kind of people that I wanted to help. But instead of helping one another, we were just kicking the hell out of each other. the kind of political games that I had been engaging in were not terribly helpful and were actually just producing this kind of violence.
Don't forget, you can listen to part 2 right now when you become a silver or gold supporter, and your early access perks include episode 3, a Cambridge Q&A event with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, available right now when you support. The links are with the show notes. For now, tell your friends. We're back, maybe. The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God is a production of Think Faith, editing assistance by Isaac Simmons. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
The Christian faith is not going away in postmodern Western culture, but actually has the potential to grow exponentially again in our time. That was how one reviewer was left feeling after reading the book that this podcast is based on. Why not grab yourself a copy of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God and find out why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again? You can even purchase a signed copy exclusively from my website. Just go to the book link with the podcast info.